Psycho is a classic Alfred Hitchcock film about a problematic man with serious mommy issues. I think I've seen this movie at least a few times by this point, but in rewatching it this time, I kind of picked up on some things that I feel like maybe I might have overlooked the first time around. Or maybe I watched it, picked up on it, but forgot about it. But one of the first things that stood out to me actually began with the credits, where in watching the movie, watching the opening credits, there's this sort of like film score, this instrumental that plays. And as it played, I realized like, this sounds really, really familiar. And I realized that it's actually from a Busta Rhymes song from like the late 90s. Early 2000s, no, late 90s. And so where they took the instrumental from was from Psycho. But like they put a little bit of a hip hop spin on it and used it as the beat for one of his songs. And it's like this kind of cartoony, outlandish Hype Williams type video. And so watching the movie, but doing other things at the same time, when I heard that, like my ears pricked up. And I was like, wait, that sounds really familiar. And then it clicked for me where I'd heard it from before. It just seemed like such a random thing. But I like these cool little things where you watch a movie and these little things, something might have been borrowed from something else. You know, one movie borrows from another, or a song takes something from a movie or whatever it is. And it's like, here you are randomly watching a movie and you hear or you see something and it clicks to you like, oh, that came from this other thing. And so I thought that was actually really cool. A few years after I graduated from college, I somehow get down like this rabbit hole kind of thing. And I ended up watching like quite a few Alfred Hitchcock movies. I don't mind movies being black and white. That's perfectly fine with me. I don't mind classics and things like that, movies from decades in the past. But sometimes I find that acting can be a little bit campy. The stories can be, let's say, thin or problematic, and given things like censorship and whatnot in the past, they can be a little bit squeaky clean, sort of lacking some of the drama of our current movies. But I kind of got into Alfred Hitchcock films. I realized that he was a filmmaker who, at least for his time, was making these movies that were a bit different from what you would see in a lot of other films. And so it's like, granted, I've seen classic movies, but I haven't seen every classic movie. But I specifically remember watching quite a few Alfred Hitchcock films. And there's this thing where quite a number of them have like a psychoanalysis component, right? That some of the things that would happen, like with this movie and I think the other film Marnie, you know, there's like this psychoanalysis aspect to it, this deeper exploration, therapy type stuff. And it's like, at least as far as what I've seen in other classic films, you don't really get much of that. The psychological movies and things like that seems to be more of a recent thing, or at least recent within the past few decades. And I love those kinds of films. Alfred Hitchcock movies then tend to really be my type. They tend to really appeal to me. And so when watching this movie, I like the story of it. You know, I like police procedurals. So something like this is just right up my alley. Here you have this young woman who's stolen this money. She's trying to get out of town, ends up staying at this motel. And it appears at first sight to be owned and operated by this, you know, nice, regular looking young man who's living at this motel with his mom. The hotel is down on like the lower level, right? Down a hill. And then you have this house up on the hill where he lives with his mom. This is Norman Bates. Now, looks can be deceiving, but this hotel does not look like one at which I might like to stay. But I guess if you don't have very many options, you're driving through a storm, you know, you fear running into worse circumstances, you might decide to just spend the night at such a motel. But the house up on the hill, it looked like a haunted house. Like when you look at haunted house movies, pictures of a haunted house, that's what this house looks like. So it's like, I don't know that I'd want to stay there. I'm certainly not staying in it. You know, I'm certainly not going in it. You know, it does, just want no parts of it. Here you are in this motel room. I've seen motels like this before. I've never really stayed in one like, you know, these kind of strip type motels where it's like 1 or 2 stories. You know, your door just opens out onto a landing or out onto the street. I feel like as a female traveling alone, it just looks incredibly unsafe. But maybe that's because, you know, this was a different time back then. You have this flimsy little door. It's like, I don't even do Airbnbs. If it's just me by myself, me and another female or something like that, that's just off the menu. It needs to be like a big group of us, a whole setup. But the setup of this hotel is just insane. This whole story of Norman Bates and his mom, what starts off as this story of this young woman who has stolen this money and run off. She has the misfortune of stopping at this Bates motel, which in some films, I don't really like this thing of convenience where you just happen to cross paths with the wrong person. That happens sometimes in real life and in true crime. Here it kind of works. It kind of bring some of the elements around this woman. Obviously this is a very old movie, so I'm not going to be very concerned with spoilers, but it's like, if you think about it, she's run off with this money. She happens to get caught in this storm and decides to ride it out at this motel, which brings her into contact with Norman Bates. That's kind of something that happens with some people where it's like, they end up meeting an unfortunate fate. They just happen to cross paths with the wrong person. But in this case, Norman seemed like a nice enough guy. Maybe that might have played a role into her deciding to stay there, that he seemed normal. But it's like, you think about it. She's run off with this money. And then the person whose money it was sends a private investigator after her. The police are looking into it, reaching out to her sister, I guess you could call him, her boyfriend and whatnot. And it's like, you think about it, had this just been a woman moving through town on her own who'd come into contact with Norman and had gone missing after staying at his hotel, you probably wouldn't have had all these people looking for her. There probably wouldn't have been all this effort put into trying to find out what happened to her. But because for this time and even now, this large sum of money that she's run off with, there's several interested parties who want to get it back and have the resources to put forward to try to get that money back. And so she arrives. You have this iconic shower scene where, she gets in after a long day, stressful day. She's taking a shower. First of all, going back to the start of the film, watching it this time around, I was kind of taken a bit aback by them showing this young woman and basically her lover meeting, the aftermath of them having met up for this afternoon tryst in this hotel, right? Because I would think, now granted, I don't know when the Hays Codes and stuff ended, but taking into consideration how prim and proper people were in the past, or at least pretended to be, I was a little bit shocked that here they were portraying something like that in a film. They obviously didn't show them in the physical act of intimacy, but rather it's implied, based on what we see going on afterwards. He has his shirt off. She's in her slip and whatnot. They're redressing after, their entanglement. There's this wealthy man at her job kind of flashing his money about and whatnot. She's put in the position of taking this large sum of money to the bank. She believes she can make better use of it than this man and his daughter, and decides to run off with the money. Now, unfortunately, circumstances occur which guides her into the path of Norman Bates. And it's surprising that he doesn't even have any, by this time, news bulletins, things like that have gone out about this missing money. Maybe, they didn't put it out there publicly like that. Or at least not this missing girl. He murders her just for the sake of it and doesn't even have any inkling about this money. At one point, she kind of hides the money in plain sight by just taking the envelope and wrapping it up in a newspaper. And so he actually picks up the newspaper and just takes it and throws it in the back of the car, not paying any attention to it. It just shows you how far removed he is from what's going on. He's unaware of anything beyond the motel. He's kind of off the grid and just really out of touch with whatever's going on. The private investigator comes out, happens across this place, decides to check it out, and, tries to figure out where she might have gone, what path she might have taken. He ends up coming across the Bates Motel. Norman's stories don't really add up, right? He asks more and more questions and ends up becoming Norman's next victim. It's kind of this thing of, because this money is at play, maybe for her sister and her boyfriend, they're concerned about what happened to her. But I think at least in some part, because of this sum of money and the questions and accusations that are floating around, it leads to there being more attention put into this young woman being missing. And so with that, it then becomes this push to figure out what exactly happened to her. But as we find out later on, that there's actually been some other young women who have gone missing, but it's not exactly clear what takes place or what lengths the police go to try to find them. But there's quite a bit of effort put into searching for this particular young woman. And so my favorite thing about the movie is actually, the stuff with the young woman, Norman Bates murdering her and whatnot. You have some pretty iconic scenes like the shower scene. It's something that you see time and time again in documentaries discussing cinema and film. But that's not even like one of my favorite scenes. It's not even like my favorite part of the movie. Like the part with the young woman at the start of the film and her coming into contact with Norman, like all of that is fine and good. But my favorite part of the movie is all the stuff that happens after she's gone missing. From like the point where the private investigator shows up and he's like sniffing around, because I like detectives and investigators, like that kind of stuff I dig. And then it's like later on when her sister and her boyfriend show up looking for her, I was actually drawn more to the later part of the movie where there's now this investigation into what happened to her, why she gone missing, rather than the early horror part of the film. Not to say it's not good, it's just that I think those were like the scenes that people refer to most, or that are regarded as being like the best and possibly some of the best moments in cinema. And that might be because it was probably new and different when like the film came out. But my favorite part of the movie is actually the later investigation, where you now have all these people trying to figure out what's happened to her. And this thing of Norman now being, because of his early actions in the movie, now being forced to have to interact with these different people. Various people come into the motel asking questions. Well, under normal circumstances, he probably gets a visitor there like once in every blue moon. Here it is that you have in a short space of time, quite a number of people coming into the motel, looking for this girl, asking questions about her, poking around and whatnot. Something that he's certainly not used to and certainly isn't prepared for. So like that part of the movie, Norman Bates interacting with the private investigator and then like these other people coming in to ask questions, that was more my favorite part of the movie. In part because by this point, you already know that he's capable of great violence, or rather his mother is capable of great violence. But it's like at this point you kind of see him sweating. You see him having these interactions with people and it's like they don't know the danger they're in, but you as the audience do. So it's like there's this tension, which I really enjoyed. And I like that you as the audience already know what happened. I like that watching the other people try to figure it out, some of them being fortunate enough to figure it out before it's too late, and then others kind of, Norman once again getting the drop on them. And so like I dig Alfred Hitchcock movies. Quite often, like some filmmakers where even some movies, they get a lot of attention, they get a lot of mentions when you discuss great films, and then you watch the movies and it's like, I don't really get the hype. But this is one of those movies that I think certainly lives up to the hype. It's an incredible movie and I highly recommend it. It's perfect for the month of May. It's a different kind of Mother's Day movie. Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.